Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on a special edition of the Hinckley Report, a dramatic increase in homelessness and crime in the state's capital has led to a crisis. How did we get here? And what are community leaders and elected officials doing to tackle the problem? Homeless service providers work with a coalition of city, county, and state leaders to find solutions. What has been done? What is in store? And how have they overcome political tensions? Operation Rio Grande took aim at removing criminals. Was it successful? Were there unintended consequences? And will efforts to revitalize downtown Salt Lake work? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Ben McAdams, Salt Lake County Mayor, Marina Lowe, Legislative and Policy Counsel at the ACLU of Utah, and Greg Hughes, Speaker of the Utah House of Representatives. We're glad to have you with us on this very special edition of the Hinckley Report. Tonight we're talking about the homeless issue in the state of Utah, those who are experiencing homelessness. And I want to ask first, this is an issue we're all talking about. It's in the news, the governor, speaker, the mayor, ACLU. Why now? What has changed that has made all of us jump on this? Speaker, here's to start with you.
Well, I'll speak personally. We as a state legislature began to become more involved in this issue and understand that it's a state issue a few sessions ago. I began to feel as a lawmaker, though, that we were paying invoices. We have a resource center that the state is contributing, resource centers that we're contributing in the construction and the funding for. Public safety officers at our Family Midvale Center. There's different needs, funding needs, that the state has participated in. But at the same time, particularly this summer, I felt that the violence and the urban chaos was growing. And I sat in a meeting right before the 4th of July holiday and was told with our Senate President that on most areas that you would measure year over year, crime, everything, the populations, everything was worse. And I said in a flippant way, because that's not news you want to hear, that you don't have to spend a dime to be worse. You can be worse for free. And to think of the state dollars that we're committing to such an important issue, to hear that was not well received by me. We walked into that 4th of July holiday, and that is where you saw a minor league baseball player who was assaulted, hit, and I don't care that he plays baseball, but there was a robbery attempt from someone experiencing homelessness. They hit him, and it's in the USA Today. And then someone searching for drugs hops the sidewalk and runs over 4 people, killing someone. And that's in the UK Daily Mail. And I'm hearing it from friends I have in Australia that they're reading about the conditions in Salt Lake City. And I think that's where, Jason, I just decided I've hit a tipping point on a personal level. And I'm going to be much more vocal, and I'm going to be much more involved, not just in the funding side, but working with the stakeholders in a more direct way. And so you've seen the legislature be more engaged and working with the mayor of the county mayor, the city mayor, stakeholders such as ACLU, because we have no more time to have any more meetings about this issue. Those days are gone for me and for many, and it was time to change this trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Mayor, how about you? Because you experienced it personally a little bit too, to try to understand the issue. Why do you think it's come to the forefront?
I think for me this started a couple of years ago when we were the issues around the shelter were getting out of control, and we looked at this and we said, okay, so Salt Lake County, we don't have police officers in the downtown. We can't do much about the law enforcement component, but what are we going to do to address the challenges that relates to homelessness? Are people entering the system and leaving on a trajectory that's better than where they came in? And the answer was no. I think we're getting a lot of people who come into the system and get stuck in the system. And at the time I went to the speaker and he said, develop a plan. Show me a plan that's actionable and the state will be there to back you up. And we brought forward a plan, and to his credit, he jumped in a couple of years ago to support us with this. And so the county brought forward a plan to reform our homeless services system. And that plan is underway. And it's moving forward well. This will be the construction of the new resource centers. But earlier this year, it always seems to get worse during the summer. We see many people who have other options, but come down to the Rio Grande area to enjoy the lawlessness, the drug dealing and the climate, the party climate of anarchy in the downtown, and they'll come out. And we knew that it was going to get worse that summer, and the county then at the time proposed some options of what we can do. But it's hard because we don't have police officers. We can't address the lawlessness. So the speaker, to his credit, said we're going to come in and we're going to address, there are two issues here. There's homelessness, and there's a plan to reform homelessness that's underway, and that's the construction of these new resource centers, bring in a more treatment-rich environment to help to reform the system. But then there's the lawlessness, and so that's what you see with Operation Rio Grande, is addressing the crime that we see in the downtown. Both of those are moving forward, and I just want to commend the speaker's been there on both, to address homelessness and to address lawlessness. But it's been a real boost to the effort to have the partnership of the state, and not just the legislative branch, but to have the partnership of the governor and the lieutenant governor coming to say they recognize now that this is a statewide problem, and they're going to help us to address it.
Sorry, Marina.
I guess I would just add that I'm grateful that we are finally having this discussion. I think one of the important points here when we're talking about homelessness and people who are experiencing homelessness is that this is a problem nationwide. It's not limited to Utah. And for years, I think we have turned the other cheek and not looked at the real drivers behind this problem. I am by no means an expert on homelessness. I want to just say that at the outset. I'm a lawyer and I focus on constitutional issues that affect this particular population. But it seems to me, just from my own sort of interest on this topic and the study that I have done, that there are a lot of drivers that we have been ignoring for a long time in our communities. Questions of mental health, when we closed our state hospitals several decades ago, and indeed there were problems with those hospitals. I'm not saying that that was the answer, but I don't think we had any alternative that we provided for people who do have severe mental health problems. Healthcare is not an option for a lot of people in the United States. That's a sad reality. And certainly with this particular population, I think access to healthcare is a problem and a barrier. We have a spike in drug use, which I think is a contributing factor. And we also have a very real problem in our communities that housing is increasingly expensive and difficult to secure. And so when you look at all of those factors coming together, I think it is no wonder that we are seeing more and more people living in extreme poverty, living on the streets in very severe and sad circumstances. And this is not unique to Utah. It's happening across the nation, and it's really disturbing and upsetting, and it's about time that we look at how are we going to solve this in a long-term and holistic fashion.
So I want to get into some of the solutions that you're coming up with, but maybe as we lead into that, because that's usually where elected officials start getting into trouble. I mean, this is territory that sometimes claims elected officials, right? So is this a concern? Why have you jumped in, even knowing that history?
So I will tell you, if you're a public servant, you have constituents, and the goal is not to make the people that you serve angry. This issue makes everyone mad. Everyone. And it doesn't matter really what you do, what path you pursue, it will make somebody angry, or they will have criticism about what you're trying to accomplish. So what we've seen is it's very difficult for public servants, for elected officials to really engage in this issue. It's been like a spent fuel rod. It has chewed up and spit out those that have tried to engage in a meaningful way in on this issue. I just think you get to a point where, what do you have to see out there? What do you have to see by way of the tragedy and the crisis going on, where you become numb to maybe those consequences of people being upset that you're getting involved in this, or they might not like how you're doing it. We just have to do the right thing, and we have to do right by people, and we have to just get to that spot. I think that's where we're at right now with elected officials, public servants, stakeholders. We're going to be numb to how adversarial the topic or the public policy issue is, and we're just going to dig in, work together in a way that you haven't seen before, but do it because people need our help.
This is not a good political issue to dive into if all you care about is politics. Earlier this year, when the legislature tasked me with finding a location for a homeless shelter, I knew at the time, so the county hadn't been involved in siting. We are more of our function is more human services and social services. We run criminal justice services and case management and health department and behavioral health services, things like that. We aren't land use like cities. Cities are more land use focused. So when the legislature tasked me with finding a location for a resource center, I knew at the time it was going to be incredibly controversial and it would cost me politically. But we had spent so much time working on this, and I went back to my team and I said, we have a choice to take this task and not move ahead, and then nothing will happen. And this problem, it is that bad. It is so bad that we need to do something. And so we pose the question to ourselves: do we walk away because it's politically expedient, or do we move ahead because it's the right thing to do? And I think what is inspiring to see is, me and my team decided to move ahead, but the speaker's moved ahead to, I think, his detriment, and now the lieutenant governor and others are.
At least the list is long.
Why do you smile when you say that?
Hopefully to his detriment. But no, people have dived in and they said, we're going to solve this problem. And I hope at the end of the day, people will judge us on the results that we accomplish and our motives for doing this. This is not there's no politically logical reason to do this, but we care and we want to address the problem. We're coming at it from different perspectives. Speaker and I don't always see eye to eye. But I think we will talk about it until we find a path forward, and that's been, I think, what's resulted is a better product from either of us could have come up with individually.
And I have it easier, of course, because the ACLU is often the subject of people's anger on all sorts of issues, so we're pretty used to it.
I guess that's true. But maybe, Marina, if you take just a second, both the speaker and the mayor had a comment too a moment ago about the statewide nature of this problem, and that's something that sometimes people don't think about. It's in your county. You represent the whole state as the speaker, but also a distinct group. Marina, why should all of Utah care about this and be watching the solutions?
Well, I think first of all, when you look at the population that's being served in the Rio Grande neighborhood, I think it's become very clear from what I've heard that it's not just people living in Salt Lake City or Salt Lake County. There are people coming from all across the state to take advantage of the services that are available in that particular area. So I do think this is a population that is broader than just this particular geographic area. But I think there's another important point, which is that whatever policy issues are being tested out or tried out in this area have consequences in terms of that ripple effect. Will that be tried in a neighboring city, in another county, in another state? And so it's really important for us to try and get things right, to make sure that we're observing and respecting people's rights, and that we're doing this in a way that really does seek to get people back on their feet again.
Okay, let's get to some of these solutions by kind of talking about some of the issues you mentioned. The first one sounds like was lawlessness. Yes. We've talked about that. So part of Operation Rio Grande, what's the approach? How do you address that one? Well, let's take that first.
I keep diving in first, so I'm going to get yelled at a break or something. But let me just say that if you spend any amount of time down there, or if you had prior to the Operation Rio Grande taking off, you would see an open-air drug market. You would see people that could buy and sell and openly use drugs in a way that I think most of Utah would be shocked to watch. As I decided, and when I hit my tipping point, that I was going to have a storefront and an office where I would bring my colleagues and other elected officials, and we would look out those windows and watch this criminal activity go on right in front of us, and ask ourselves questions. Who are we looking at? Are we looking at a Honduran drug cartel member? Are we looking at someone who needs a treatment bed? Are we looking at someone who needs a hand up and a job? The fact of the matter is, we didn't know who we were looking at. This economy of scale, where we tried to bring services and a shelter in one place, was well-intentioned, but the economies of scale had only served, I believe, the greatest advantage to the criminal element. And that anonymity of not knowing who people are or what their story is or how we could help them or serve justice was really hurting and creating actual real barriers where people were afraid to come into those areas. When we decided to move forward in this, we had to break that ecosystem of crime because we felt that was pulling more people into addiction. It was scaring people away that needed help because they didn't want to be exposed to the drug culture, or they didn't want to be a victim of the violence. And so there was surveillance done. There were those that seemed to be the highest drug traffickers, or those that were causing the greatest criminal activity. And this was not a sweep from one side of a street to another. When this effort began, it was surgical, and it was meant to go after those that we believed, or that law enforcement believed, were really the greatest cause of that criminal element. We went after that, and we believe that when you lower the fear, people can begin to come back to this area, and that is where we can look at the treatment beds, and we can look at the help and the intervention that's needed as you start to attack the criminal element.
Okay, Mayor, is that happening? So we've identified surveillance, a lot of people arrested in this particular process. Tell us what the impact has been and the strategy going forward on that.
So I think one of the perspectives we brought to the table is really a understanding that law enforcement alone will not solve the problem. Simply taking somebody off the streets. Now, there are dangerous people on our streets who need to be locked up, and they need to be incarcerated for the crimes that they're committing and the public safety issues they're causing. But there are people who have addiction issues that they need treatment. If you take those people and put them in jail for a few weeks and then let them go and they come back to the street and they're dealing again, oftentimes what happens is that trip through jail makes them worse. They get better connected and exposed to new substances. And so, we felt strongly that what was needed also was a long-term play, not just a short-term solution, but and we needed a short-term solution. I'm not denigrating that, but we needed a long-term solution as well, and that was treatment. We need to provide those who are in need, who have behavioral health and substance abuse disorder, to get them into treatment, and that's how we can start bending the curve on the long term. So what happened with this operation is we have gone in, we did surveil, we have arrested the dangerous people, but we're also using the law enforcement effort to expand treatment options and to get people in treatment. They're in jail. We offer them a different path rather than sitting in a jail cell. We expanded this drug court that gives people a drug court where we give people an option to accept treatment, to comply with terms of treatment, to work with the system and have the system work with them to get them stabilized and help them to overcome their habits and their addictions. And we think that by doing that, you actually bring in, it's not going to happen overnight, but you bring in a long-term solution as you help people get back to their families, get back on their feet, reconnect with their families, have their families accept them back because they're no longer an addict. They can get a job and they can get stabilized, and that's the long-term game. And that's going to take time. That has started. It's nowhere near where it needs to be, but it has started. And my focus as the county mayor, since we aren't law enforcement, but we're more the human services, is to make sure we can bring those treatment resources online as quickly as possible, and that treatment works within the context of criminal justice as a restorative justice.
Interesting. Go ahead, Marina.
Well, I think those are all well and good, and I don't disagree that treatment is an important and integral part of this entire process. I guess our concern really comes down to how we are prioritizing law enforcement versus treatment. And at this point in time, I do absolutely concede and believe that the intentions of the two gentlemen on either side of me are good and in the right place. But nevertheless, the numbers reflect that we have 1,100 arrests. The drug court that you mentioned, Mayor, there's 35 people out of that 1,100 that have been provided that option so far. I understand there's a little bit more capacity, but that's not nearly enough to solve the problem for a lot of these individuals that have been arrested. Furthermore, from what I understand of those 1,100 individuals, 70% of them were booked and are back out on the street again and have been released. I'm not sure that these are the worst of the worst, the most dangerous criminal elements. In fact, the arrest records show that a lot of them are not for serious crimes. The other piece that the ACLU cares deeply about, and perhaps is an organization best positioned to raise this issue, is the question of what are some of the other obligations that the state has, namely the Sixth Amendment, that might be getting forgotten in this mix. So when these 1,100 people are being arrested and charged with a crime, are we making sure that there are sufficient resources in terms of public defenders able to help them? And I would assert that at this point, that part of the equation has fallen off.
I want to jump in. So I've heard this from the local papers, and we just heard Marina point this out, that there's been this decision made by some that we haven't identified the worst of the worst. I would ask anyone how they would necessarily know that, because I didn't say it was El Chapo. I didn't say it was Manuel or Noriega. I didn't say it was John Wayne Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer. What I said is we have law enforcement, multiple agencies that went in there and surveilled and watched where the crimes were going on and who those criminals who were having the most detrimental impact, profiting from the selling of poison to people. Who were those people? We didn't have because we have the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, we've taken some of those what would have been felonies, and we've said, look, to Mayor McAdams' point, don't send them to jail where they've had an addiction and they may have committed a crime that was a felony, and then they go into this graduate school of criminality. Let's make that a misdemeanor, but let's get them help. If your grand description of what's serious is a felony, well, then we're indicting our very own Justice Reinvestment Initiative because we changed some of those penalties. What we're saying is there was a concerted and comprehensive effort to look at where the fountainhead of the worst of crimes were occurring and to go after that. And we think that with and jail beds are a difficult issue, as we know. 300 that are incarcerated, but many of those that you book and that you have fingerprints and you know who they are, the criminal element doesn't want to be known. They don't want you to know who they are. In an environment where there's going to be consequences for the behavior that's going on, we want to see these cartels and those that have profited from this carnage leave. Go somewhere else, because Utah, we're going to know who people are so we can help them, but we also are determined to serve justice, and that, we hope, is a climate that the criminal element does not want to continue to operate in.
I want to jump in, and it was concerns that Marina raised, similar concerns from me and my team, that gave me some pause before we jumped into Operation Rio Grande. And I will admit that treatment resources have not been coming online fast enough. Now, look, it takes time to build the facilities and hire social workers and train the social workers and get them online, but we are moving as rapidly as we can to get those treatment resources online. The point that we came to is we said, look, we could delay, and we could wait until everything is perfectly aligned and ready to go. But you know, I saw what it was like down there. That is not a safe place to have kids, to have families, to have our state's most vulnerable. We are telling them, if you need help, come and receive help. If you need treatment, come to Rio Grande. By the way, there's a drug cartel and you might get killed, and you're going to be offered drugs every 10 feet. I looked at it and said, doing nothing is not an option. Now, was the operation perfect? Was it ideal to launch without having adequate treatment resources? Not at all. But we had to do something to address the public safety in the Rio Grande. The treatment is coming, and I'm quite happy with what's happening now with treatment. We will see an increase in treatment funding of $100 million. This will double. First and foremost, it will double the capacity for residential inpatient treatment. That's incredible. And as the mayor of Salt Lake County that is responsible for many of these behavioral health and treatment resources, to double the system that will come close to really addressing the need, that's an incredible opportunity.
So I just want to concede absolutely that I understand the intent was to break up the criminal element down there, and that was the purpose of moving quickly and doing it in the way that it was done. And I also want to concede that I understand that most of the arrests have not been for sort of status type of crimes, so camping and that sort of thing, and I think that's a good thing. My only point is that the ACLU continues to be concerned that we have this law enforcement push. It means these people now have additional criminal records. We know that one of the drivers of homelessness is having a criminal record, and so we are concerned that we're seeing this sort of happen on the one end and not these other things happening on the back end. Both treatment, but also this question of public defense. I mean, I just think it's worth noting that right now the Salt Lake Public Defender's Office, I have heard their misdemeanor attorneys have a caseload of 600 cases per year per attorney. I mean, that is absolutely ridiculous. That is 200 more than the ABA recommends as the absolute maximum for an attorney to be able to ethically do their job and properly represent their client. So that is a real significant problem. And it's also worth noting the state is currently fighting a lawsuit regarding the provision of indigent defense under the Sixth Amendment. So, the state is on notice that this is already a problem that we have in our state, and yet we're sort of exacerbating that problem by not properly addressing this.
Okay, let's talk about some of the efforts that have happened just this week. Speaker, special session was called. Yes. $4.9 million allocated, and this is something that you did in conjunction with both sides of the aisle on this as well. Tell us what happened in this session, what this $4.9 million is going for, and what happens, and we'll go down the line after that.
So government doesn't do this, and service providers in this space have, prior to this, probably have never done this. We did what we called harmonizing our budgets. We have federal dollars, we have state dollars, we have county dollars, city dollars and budgets spent in this space, and then we have our service providers. We all came together when we realized we were going to work together in a way that doesn't happen, and government's really not designed to do it the way we're trying to do this. We're going to make sure that we're not repeating efforts in terms of the way we spend our dollars. We're going to look at, can we utilize the dollars we're already spending and get more out of those dollars? And then when we do all of that, and we've looked and we've made sure we're not duplicating those things and we're getting the most out of the dollars we have, what is that remaining amount that we need to add to this effort? Out of a $67 million effort, 2/3 of that budget, and that's for 2 years, That's from now till June of 2019. And why is that date significant? That's when we hope these resource centers that are smaller and more centralized to certain demographics, women with children, and one's resource center, for instance, they're scheduled to open then. And so we need a plan from now, today, until that time where those resource centers open. So it's a 2-year budget of $67 million, of which 2/3 of that budget are existing funds doing more with what we already have, or what you saw in the special session, taking dollars from one area that were not being used and reallocating those dollars into another area where we do need the funding and we need to have that happen. So there was a budget transfer that we did that began that process of some of those dollars that we as a state have identified. More importantly than the $5 million transfer was what you saw on the floor of the House, and I wasn't in the Senate. I try to avoid the Senate. No, but I'm sure this happened in the Senate as well. The expressions of support from my colleagues who are across this state, who, again, as we talked about the politics of this, it would be very easy to ignore or to say this is a Salt Lake City problem or a Salt Lake County problem. There was an incredible groundswell of support from lawmakers across the state. I thought the symbolism of that shows that this state and its public servants are on the right track.
Mayor, how did you feel about the approach there?
You know, I was so excited to see the state step in, to see the support of the speaker. It was unanimous in the House, and to see the state really recognizing that this is not just a Salt Lake City or a Salt Lake County issue. And I hope what the public sees is what's happening here is you have the state, the county, the city, all working together. Now look, as I said, as you saw in this program, we don't always agree, and we're coming at this with different ideas, and we try to find some middle ground. I think the role of the ACLU has been a good one. They are aggressively looking over our shoulder and making sure that this is telling us where they don't think it's living up to expectations, and I think they're making the process better. Now, we don't always agree with them, but everybody coming together really with the goal of having a good program at the end and a good outcome. And what I hope is the public understands that it's never going to be perfect. We have kicked the can down the road for years on this, and as we try to solve it now, it is really hard and it's going to take time, and we're going to get there.
Okay, that's going to have to be the last word on this, but it is so refreshing to see so many people from all spectrums working on this thing. Thank you for your comments today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That's it for the special edition of the Hinckley Report. KUED has created several programs and outreach efforts as part of a homelessness initiative starting in November. Please go to KUED.org to find out more. Thank you for joining us. Good night.